Hello and welcome everyone to the second webinar of 2021 from the HRB Trial Methodology Research Network. I'm Vivian Hanrahan and I'm the webinar coordinator, and I'd like to extend the warmest of welcomes to everyone joining us today, whether you're coming from the office, the home office, the spare room or the cupboard under the stairs. We are really delighted to welcome February's webinar presenter today, who is Dr. Darren Dahly. So Darren has brilliantly titled his presentation today with how to play nicely with your trial statistician and how to get them to play nicely with you. So Dr. Darren Dahly is Principal Statistician at the HRB Clinical Research Facility in Cork and is Senior Lecturer of the Research Methods at UCC School of Public Health. He consults and collaborates on a wide variety of patient-focused studies in and around Cork and teaches postgraduates about clinical trials, study design and analysis, reproducible research methods and critical appraisal skills. You can also find him talking about trial methods on Twitter, and his handle is StatsEpi, and I'm sure he'll give you a reminder of that at the end of the talk. So it's looking like it's going to be a real treat today with Darren and with his presentation. So we'd really appreciate the engagement for everyone in the audience listening and watching. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put these questions to Darren at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Darren, who is on mute. Darren, if you just unmute there. And is it there yet? No, hold on. Maybe I need to ask you to unmute. 1 second, everybody.
Not being able to move my slides forward. Anyway, sorry, I've been told to turn off my video, but before I do, I just wanted to thank Vivian, Sandra Declan, Francis Sheely, and everyone at the TMRN for the invitation to come talk today, and to thank all of you for taking your time. I hope you're all having something nice to eat or a cup of coffee or something and enjoying a lunch, and hopefully I will be at least mildly entertaining for the talk. But now I wanted to show that I have a jacket on. I do take this very seriously. But with that said, I'll go ahead and turn off my video. I've been told it's going to crash the whole thing if I don't. So there we go. And I need to also quickly acknowledge a collaborator. Like most of you, I was up early this morning working on these slides. And so without his contributions, it probably wouldn't be nearly as good as it was. So we'll just say thank you to him and move on. Okay, so I was looking down the list quickly of participants and getting nervous and whatnot. And I know there's a lot of kind of trial expertise attending today, and I think we'd all agree that one of the fundamental aspects of working in clinical trials is just how much they rely on so many different pieces and parts and experts working together to make things go. And this isn't to discount other forms of research, and I've been involved in lots of different types of research, but clinical trials typically take place in working health facilities where there are patients involved and people who are actually doing their day job of practicing medicine and nursing and physiotherapy and everything else, which adds this whole other level of complexity. And so I just want to acknowledge all of those experts and how thankful I am to get to work with so many smart people by working in clinical trials and learn from them, and hopefully they learn from me from time to time as well. And this, though, will be a talk obviously from a statistician's point of view. And from that point of view, and in the context of clinical trials, this is how I view my responsibility to the patients, to my collaborators, to the trial itself, which is to help ensure essentially the scientific integrity of the trial. And it's not just to talk, though, about statisticians, it's about to talk about a very special relationship in the context of a clinical trial, which is that between the statistician and the clinical investigator. And it's really these two roles, and there will be, multiple statisticians, multiple investigators. It's really about these two roles coming together to complement each other and our respective expertises in order to make the trial work. And that's what this talk is about. It's about this relationship. And a lot of the stuff I'll say isn't rocket science, right? It's maintaining relationships are about trust. They're about respect. They're about kindness and generosity. And it's the same. Right, making a working relationship between a statistician and clinical investigator is exactly the same. It all starts with trust and respect. But it also requires understanding. So we'll get to the first little tip, if you will, something I feel I've learned over a number of years now working with clinical investigators. And that is that the clinical investigator and the statistician are very different types of people typically. And this isn't a surprise. We have typically very, very different jobs. And the more closely I work with clinicians, the more and more impressed I've grown over the years at their ability to confidently make decisions in the presence of a lot of uncertainty, and to make good decisions and to process a lot of complicated information. But at the end of the day, clinicians need to make decisions. They need to make them promptly, and they need to make them confidently. That is an important skill set, a vitally important one. On the other hand, the clinicians will know, who have worked with statisticians, that we are famously difficult to get to make a conclusion about anything. Statisticians have been arguing about even what the word probability means for a few hundred years. Only just a few years ago did the American Statistical Association come out with a comment on p-values, something we've been using for around 120 years of technology. We are notoriously bad at making quick, prompt decisions. But the important thing to acknowledge here is that these things can make us kind of fall into conflict sometimes, these kind of tendencies. And certainly not all clinical investigators are alike, and not all statisticians are alike. But it's the differences also that we need to contribute to the trial to make them work. So we have to understand each other, and we have to see these things as strengths, not as frustrations or weaknesses. Now, that said, this talk really should have been a duet. It shouldn't just be a statistician up here talking. There should be a clinical investigator too. So if anybody ever wants to move that forward, let me know and we can talk about it. But I need to say up front that a lot of the stuff I'm going to say, obviously I'm kind of jibing with the title of the talk, that how to play nicely with your trial statistician. It kind of implies that there are clinical investigators that don't. And while that's kind of true, it's certainly not been my experience, and it's not been the experience of people I've talked to about. At the end of the day, the vast majority of people working in academic research, clinical medicine, and clinical trials are extremely hardworking, extremely competent, extremely intelligent, and extremely caring. And so if at any point this talk feels a little bit like I'm wagging the finger, I want you to know that I know that the things I'm talking about, if you're a clinical investigator, are not your fault. And we're going to come back to this point over and over again, because at the end of the day, we have to understand each other, but we have to understand that we are conducting research in this context of clinical research that has a lot of deficiencies, and that we are all having to deal with these deficiencies together. And that typically it's the environment and its deficiencies that can create some of the friction and the problems that I'm going to talk about. So again and again, I'll come back to, this isn't your fault, this is how it is, but these are some ideas for how we can improve on things. Okay. Take a deep breath. So we are talking about a context, and the biggest part of trying to understand this context, which we have to come to grips with, or else the whole talk is going to feel like I'm wagging the finger at clinical investigators, is that we all tend to agree that statistical expertise is important for good science. And I think when we talk about all those experts that we require to run a good clinical trial, I think everybody was probably nodding their head. Everybody agrees with that. All the parts are necessary. And so then the question then, a somewhat paradoxical one, is, well, where are all the statisticians, right? Because I know the frustration that people feel because they want to talk to a statistician. They want the input from a statistician, but they can't ever find one, or they can't find one easily. So we have to kind of unpack this just a little bit. And the first thing to kind of understand, I think, from my perspective, is the difference between regulated and non-regulated trials. In the regulated trial of medicines, which is where we require them, the involvement of a statistician, is implied, if not actually mandated by the law, right? All of the clinical trial, good clinical trial practices, ICH, everything else says that you have to have a trial statistician involved, right? And so it's not surprising then that regulated trials always include statisticians. That's always part of the thing. Now, I've never worked in industry. I am not an expert on industry trials, for sure, but I'm generally aware of this idea that they tend to have more money, right? And money is super, super useful for research and for doing things like contracting or hiring statisticians to be involved in your trial. And because it's restricted, because regulatory trials are mostly for medicines, as societies, we've determined that the kind of free market approach and market-based approach to developing drugs is a very good one. This isn't a comment on that. That's fine with me. So it's not surprising then that industry and who tend to sponsor regulated trials have the money to actually pay for statisticians. And so you'll never not have a regulated trial without a statistician, or almost not never. So that's a really important thing to first understand if that's not something you're familiar with. And so I think it has to raise the question for us sitting here today, which will underpin a lot of what we discuss, is if regulated trials are so deserving of this expertise, in fact, it's required, then why don't non-regulated and academic-led trials require it just the same way, right? We have to ask that question. And so people are left essentially then scrambling to find access to a statistician because statisticians are not provided to us when we are trying to conduct our academic-led studies. And so those non-regulated trials tend to fall to academia. They tend to be academic-led. And of course, in the university, the financial situation is always very, very different. So this problem of how to find a statistician is kind of at the root of all of this, at least some of it. And so the first solution that people come up with, and with apologies to all of my colleagues, and I have lots of them, who work in statistics departments. I do not, and I'll come back to that in a second. Sometimes the idea is, well, we'll just get someone from the stats department to work with, right? These people just grow on trees, and you go down to the stats department, and there'll be someone waiting for you, and they'll be really engaged and really interested in helping you with your clinical trial. And the problem with this perspective is that a lot of, and this is understandable, of academic statisticians aren't really interested in the applied side of things. Many of them are, but a lot of them aren't. They aren't really interested in all the other little bits and bobs that go into running a clinical trial, developing a protocol, everything that, all the bits and pieces that go into it, because those things don't necessarily contribute to their career. They're not necessarily interested in working with an investigator to kind of find the common ground and learn from each other. These tend to be people who have a very specific interest in the kind of nitty-gritty theoretical and mathematical aspects of statistics. That's what's drawing them to it, right? So they're not always going to be a very good solution to this problem, and this problem is very widespread. And there's some, there's great quotes about this. I don't think this has changed at all. And again, to the more theoretical or mathematical statisticians out there, my apologies. But this is Donald Nayland writing in the 50s that you could get this theoretical statistician, but they might have problems kind of fitting in with the context of the research, the clinical context of the research, and will be more interested in essentially using the experiment to support the mathematical ideas rather than using the mathematical ideas to illustrate the experiment or illuminate the experiment. And so I think that's still an issue that comes up today. So this isn't a very satisfying solution to where am I going to get a statistician? It's not going to be walking down, not very often. Now, I've heard other people think that this is a great idea, but they tend to be the head of a school or the head of a college, and then they get the head of statistics maybe to collaborate, and that can work. And you can find these relationships, and when you do, they can be very productive. It's just not a consistent solution. Okay, so the next step, you are told you need a statistician. You've got to have one. We don't have one for you. This is necessary, but we do not provide this for you at our research institution. So, but what we do have is we have a building over there. It's over there. It's behind that alley, and there's a door. And if you open the door, it's a low lit room, and there's a couple people in there. And those are that's our consultancy. That's our statistical consultancy. And you go see the statistical consultant. Now, a good number of very good statisticians will nobly take on this role of being a kind of jack of all trades consultant, someone with an open door policy that you can go and you can see and talk about your problems. And that's a great thing for them. And it's very, like I said, it's very noble and thankless work, but it's also not a really good solution to our problem. Remember, in the context of a clinical trial, we're all trying to learn from each other. I cannot emphasize enough how much I learn from clinical investigators about the problems they're dealing with, and then how that directly influences how we might design the trial and analyze the resulting data. You just can't undersell that at all. And this is one of my favorite quotes. I almost always bring it up. And this idea, there are no routine statistical questions, only questionable statistical routines. And so when we turn statistics into consultancy, we are almost certainly reducing it to these more kind of routine aspects of statistics, and we're missing out on opportunities in order to go deeper and do better. So moving on, not a satisfying solution. Now, we could use the existing clinical trial infrastructure funded by the HRB and others, and find a trial statistician. And there is a lot of wisdom in this approach. And I know this is somewhat self-serving because I am funded this way, but this is a really good idea. This is what we should do. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. The other things are very unsatisfying. This is what we should do. We should have a clinical trial infrastructure, and that should include statisticians. And if we are, no talk can go without a mention of COVID-19. And if we are thinking about the real successes of research in the context of the pandemic, there's probably nothing more impressive than recovery, right? Which you're talking, they've randomized over 35,000 patients, actual sick people, over 150 active sites recruiting. And the world, has to be astonished by this. Nothing else has come close. But it's not rocket science why this has happened, right? You have a national health system where there's research integrated into it through the NIHR. You have a well-developed, registered system of clinical trials, of registered clinical trial units all over the country. Every one of those units is staffed with, numerous experts in trials, and that's their job. They are there, right? This is an amazing accomplishment. And this is what, at the right scale, this is the kind of thing I think we should be thinking about. This is the way this works for them. This is how this has succeeded. When we come to Ireland and what we have here, which again, the idea is exactly right. And I hope we continue to build and expand on it. Right. But this is from the last report, and it's, it's not completely up to date, but this was the kind of the green dots here are the number of, statisticians funded through the HRB clinical trial infrastructure. So I could actually find myself when I open this. Now I've got Brendan Palmer working with me now. He should be on there for sure. And then Galway's always been very strong in biostatistics, and not surprisingly, they got a number of people there. Those specific dots have changed a little bit. But the point here is that the scale should be very apparent. Okay, so there's statisticians working in statistics departments. There are consultant statisticians, but there's very few of these roles. I feel very fortunate to have one of these jobs. I like it a lot, and I will explain a little bit more of that in a minute. Now, that picture isn't exactly a complete accurate presentation of how many working kind of medical statisticians. And when I say the term medical statistician, I kind of mean someone who's more on the applied end, at least part of their interest, and working in clinical research, trying to support studies, including trials. And so we had a meeting about this time last year, actually, where I think we had around 50 people who all raised their hand and said, I'm a medical statistician. We all met in Limerick. We had a super fantastic day kind of talking about, career paths and how to best support studies and how we can be best supported. And a lot of the things I talk about kind of come out of that meeting and a lot of the conversations we had. And so Norma organized that, and that was fantastic. And we're kind of continuing to think about how to develop this even more. So we do have, outside of the funded infrastructure, there are very good people. Like Limerick has tons of good statisticians who get involved in clinical research and other places in the country. But we also have like kind of people who work in a specific hospital, and they came down for the day, and it was really nice to see. As someone who's not from here, I always get the impression that all Irish people know each other. Which is probably not correct technically, but it was kind of one of those nice days. Everybody was greeting and meeting. It was lovely. Okay, and so now we get to kind of the problem that we all have to deal with. And that is, well, you're a clinical investigator, the statistics have to be done. And so you're just gonna have to do it yourself because you're smart and you're motivated and you need to do this for your career and to do some research. And you're just going to have to get on with it. You just need to do the stats yourself. And I've learned over the years that this is what doing the stats yourself tends to look like. Not everybody, for sure. Some people, some clinical investigators are very sophisticated statisticians, much better than I am. Those people 100% exist. But most of the time when it means do the stats yourself, it is data into an Excel spreadsheet. It is pick out a statistical test based on a flow chart. It is pop it into SPSS. But the most important thing here is that it's usually a clinician who has a day job and maybe a night job and a lot of responsibility. And they're being asked to do the stats work, you know, in the off hours, in the free time, as if that exists. It shouldn't be rocket science to see why this is suboptimal. Now, back to Robin Williams, it's not your fault, right? If you're having to do this, this is not your fault. I'm your friend. I want you to not have to do this, right? This is a travesty in so many ways. You already have a job, right? There's already something you are very good at, a job that is very necessary for you to do well. Now, this does come into one small bit of a kind of a finger wag, and that is there's an imbalance here. So I tweeted, we love joking about this. It's the surgeons, it's always the surgeons. And I can pick on the surgeons because then all the other medical doctors will help me pick on the surgeons as well. And it's always the surgeons that seem to kind of know better. And so I was kind of poking fun at it with this idea, you know, that I'd start doing some videos about surgical techniques from the perspective of a statistician. And, you know, the imbalance is really obvious. It's ludicrous. It's obscene for me to pretend like I understand anything about being a clinician, because I don't. And it doesn't matter if I'm in the hospital. It doesn't matter how many studies I've been involved in. It doesn't matter how many clinicians from however many different specialties and areas, and, you know, nursing and physiotherapy and speech pathology and all the rest of it. None of it matters. Like, I don't know anything about that. There's a reason they don't let me talk to people like in my day job. And so there's just no attempt. It just can't exist. On the flip side, though, there are, unfortunately, a lot of, and not most, but there are a lot of clinical investigators who do think that they can match the expertise of someone who does this statistics thing full time. And sometimes that can create some challenges and some difficulties. But importantly, to come back to the context, there's a reason why this happened, right? And so this is our last little bit about the background, and then we can actually spend the second half talking about the statistics bits. That there's a history to this, right? So if you think about the earlier part of you know, the 1930s, say, all of a sudden statistics kind of happened. Now, statistics existed before that for sure, and probability theory and all the rest of it. But in terms of clinical medicine and medical research, you didn't need to have any statistics in your research papers. Like, that was a thing that didn't exist. People were starting to complain about it in the late 20s and early 30s. But then suddenly, a decade later, and certainly by the 50s, you could not publish medical research without having, you know, statistical content. So if you think about, that's a really radical change. That is going from a way of thinking about data that in terms of medicine did not exist in terms of clinical research to becoming a requirement, right? So of course, people had to do this for themselves to a certain degree, right? And the other thing that happened was that essentially the publication model we use, you know, kind of took root and distorted things. And so the goal, as much as anything, became to publish papers. And so if the rate limiting step is a statistician to be involved in your study, but you're still incentivized to publish papers, and that's how you're going to make your name and be promoted and all the rest of it, then obviously, if we can do without the statisticians, then we're going to do that. Okay, so, you know, the question then is, how has that worked out? And so I don't think I've ever given a talk in the past, well, 5 or 6 years at least, where I don't include this quote from Doug Altman. And people who know me will, well, no, people who know me won't be sick of it, because this is usually their favorite quote too. And it's simple. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And this is 1994. This, to me, it says everything about the big problem we're dealing with. We are producing so much research. And that is a problem, because we're having a very hard time keeping up. When we start to talk about all the experts you need to do research, this is an issue. And, you know, we can jump forward, right? So we have Marcia Angel. She was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, you know, in the early aughts, not believing that much of the clinical research is public, is true, is believable, right? That's an amazing indictment of how this is all working. Richard Horton, the same thing. You know, he's pointing out this, that much of the literature might be very unreliable, conflicts of interest, small sample sizes, tiny effects, and so on. There's an irony there, you know, that nobody's acknowledging the role of publication in all of this, but these are real problems that everybody needs to be very aware of. And this gets characterized very nicely by this idea of research waste, and people should become very familiar with this, that a lot of the research we do is just wasted. And some of it doesn't get to patients, some of it isn't good questions, but a lot of it has to do with poor designs, poor analysis, and poor reporting, which all falls into the kind of purview of an expert statistician. And kind of on that point, this isn't just about doing the statistics in terms of how do I interpret the p-value, how do I design this, how do I analyze the data. When we think about an analysis, right, we go from the design, we go through the raw data, we tidy it up, we might run some models and estimate things, we do summaries, we draw conclusions, we report. At any stage along this pipeline, if something goes wrong, the entire result can be completely invalidated. So if we're asking people to put data into spreadsheets, you know, pick a statistical test from a flow chart and then analyze them as SPSS, that is not what it looks like when I do this work, right? There is a professionalism to this that you bring, that a clinical investigator will bring to their day job. I bring that same professionalism to my day job because I know these mistakes are really important and they matter. And I can go on and on showing examples, and I'm not going to waste your time, but it's really important if we understand the consequences of these things. So here's a study that got where the randomization code got flipped. And this paper made it, to JAMA. Now, it's a credit to all the investigators involved that they found and corrected the problem. But something else interesting here is this is out of the Johns Hopkins Biostatistics Center. These are people who really know what they're doing, right? They do have some processes for preventing these things. And the point here isn't to point the finger and say they made a mistake. The point is that everybody makes these mistakes. And if you're not dealing with your data, if you're doing the stats yourself and you don't have the workflow and the process in place to try to catch this stuff, there's no telling what's going on. I promise that mistakes are being made. This is a serious thing. This is a very serious problem. And these little things are just everywhere. And I'll leave with one more example. This is published in the Lancet. So in the abstract, they report an odds ratio indicating a binary, outcome. So here's some treatment effect. It's an odds ratio. You go into the paper and you find out that the treatment effect, there it is. It's the same thing, 1.036, but it's from a linear model. It's from an ANCOVA. And it's just because the outcome is log transformed, so they exponentiate it, right? That's a ratio of geometric means. If you don't know that, you don't need to know that. You need to ask the statistician that. But the point is that it's not an odds ratio. And so this stuff might be very kind of ticky, but it's not. It's wrong. And the key thing here, and the stuff that can frustrate statisticians and plenty of clinical investigators who know as well, that this stuff happens all the time. This is constant. And you have to understand and come to understand the degree that this is a problem in order to fix it. Because most of the time we just sit around doing this. This is fine. We know these problems exist, problems with the reporting, problems with analyses, problems with the data. And I don't see a lot of people trying to actively solve that problem, at least not on the scale that would be required. And you really do have to center this, that this research you're doing is important, right? If you get to the point where you're finding effects of treatments that don't work, that's harmful, But it's also the point, and this is a little more subtle, that if you're running substandard studies because they're not well designed, because you don't have the appropriate expertise to design them well, then you might be needlessly delaying the discovery of efficacious treatments, right? So you might have to wait 5 more years for someone to do the study because you weren't able to detect the effect that was there. It's just really important to come back to this. Okay, so that is the house is on fire part of the talk. If you're a statistician, you probably found that very entertaining, I hope. If you're a clinical investigator, you might be slightly annoyed, and is this productive for you? So hopefully what we get to next will also be a bit more productive. But the first thing is this, I love this picture Brendan Palmer sent me, and I think it says everything about design. And I think the clinical investigator could see this exactly the same way I do. Like it's just, you can pay me less if you just let me do everything. And if you need to be really involved, then it's gonna cost you more. And we have to avoid this situation, right? We have to build trust. You have to know that I know what I'm talking about. So when we have a conversation, and you say, I'd like you to replicate this analysis. And I say, well, that's not an odds ratio. Well, right here in the Lancet, it says it's an odds ratio. Okay, I get that it says it in the Lancet, it's an odds ratio, but you need to trust me right now. And I need to tell you it's not an odds ratio, but it's right there, and you see how this goes. So we have to build trust. And this goes back to this idea of consultancy as well. These relationships are important. It's important people can see, oh, Darren caught the mistake in the data, or this person caught the error, or this person had the better idea. And you remember that the next time. Just like when I'm working with an investigator and they come correct, you know, I'm like, that's a great person to work with. They really understand the problem. This is really nice. Like, that's the stuff we need, and it doesn't work well with this consultancy model. All right, so real problems. My grant or abstract is due in 3 days, please help. So this happens a lot. Everybody knows this. It's almost stereotypical at this point, but it continues to happen. Again, it's not your fault. If we were all in a room together at this point, I'd have you all saying it's not your fault. We know it's not your fault, right? And so the goal then is, how can we speed this up a little bit? You know, if it's going to be like this, it's not your fault because you didn't have the support to understand the grant was coming due. You didn't have the protected time to put the grant in or the abstract in. We all know why it happened. So let's try to think about ways to speed things up. And the number one thing that any statistician, I think, you know, probably 99% will tell you is that the challenging bit at the beginning is that we have to understand the actual research question time and time again. And the other tricky thing about trials is that you can't leave it to the end. The way the data are going to be analyzed at the end of the study is going to be completely determined by the design of the study at the beginning. Like, the analysis is the easy part. It doesn't mean statistics is easy. It means that statistics and design are the same thing. And all the input that you think the statistician is going to bring to the end actually needs to come in at the beginning. So you've got to come in ready to know what your actual research question is. And the first step on this, and you know, people will sometimes try to argue, but I've never heard a convincing argument, is that there are basically 3 important goals that we can use data to learn about in the context of clinical research. We can do description, where we're evidencing problems, and we don't give this enough credit. Description is incredibly important. We don't know if problems exist to move on to solutions if we haven't described them accurately. We can do prediction, right? So diagnosis, prognosis, risk calculators. And that's an important contrast to the third, which is cause and effect, which is what we use trials for predominantly. And, you know, understand the effects of interventions. And while those 2 things feed into each other, if I can predict, I probably have a better understanding of cause and effect. If I understand cause and effect, I can make better predictions. From an analytical point of view and a design point of view, they require different things, even from the same data. So if you can get to a point where you can say what it is you really need to do, because a number of people, they'll come to me and they say, I need to know if this is associated with that. It's like, well, okay, I can tell you if they're associated, but I need to know why. Are you trying to make a prognosis? Are you trying to say what's going to happen to this person in 5 years' time? Or are you trying to understand the causal effect of this thing you want to know? So just being able to put your research into that simple thing. If you walked into a statistician's office and you said, I want to know if this causes that, I want to be able to predict this outcome in 5 years, that would fly you through so much of the initial kind of steps of working these things out. Now, sample size, which I call sample size theater, because it is more of a guessing game than we acknowledge, despite the fact that oftentimes we find ourselves trying to deal with the sample size calculation in scare quotes without enough information to actually support that. But there are things that you should know to facilitate and speed that process up. And they have absolutely nothing to do with statistics whatsoever. This is where you bring in your expertise as the clinician, your understanding of what you're trying to do with the patient or the client or whomever. And it's these kind of questions that you should know. So first, how many patients could you possibly hope to recruit, right? We often start this idea of a sample size evaluation of, well, how many should we get? Well, the starting point is almost always, well, how many can you get, right? And then we can ask the question, given this constraint, then can we ask, you know, useful questions? Is it worth doing the study? If not, if you know you can't get enough and you know the study isn't going to be big enough to provide kind of confident answers about anything, then you have to start thinking about, how do I make it more amenable to be included in meta-analysis? How do I find other centers to collaborate with? right? There's no point in doing research. This goes back to research waste. There's no point in doing research that you can't recruit to at all. So the starting point is you have to be able to tell me, this is how many patients come through in a year. This is how many with this condition. This is how many we expect to meet our inclusion criteria. And you should know this, right? This kind of information shouldn't be that hard to find. You should be thinking about this in advance. The other thing is that clinicians should be masters of outcomes, right? A trial is a way to estimate a causal effect. A causal effect is a difference between two or more groups with respect to some outcome that matters. And we need to know which outcomes matter the most, which of those you can actually measure. And again, there are some statistical considerations, but it's this question of what matters most to you and to patients, more importantly, that is probably needs to be first. And so that's something you should be able to come to the statistician already knowing. A next level from that is, what do these outcomes look like? What do they tend to look like in these kinds of patients? How rare is this outcome? How common is it? How is it distributed? Do most people kind of have high values and a few with low, or all kind of lumped up in the middle? Understanding distributions of outcomes is a very important thing too, and coming with papers that have already kind of evidenced this information. Look, they found that the mean and standard deviation in blood pressure in this particular population was this. You need to come with that information. The statistician should need to ask for that. That's just wasting your valuable time. And then a final thing is that you need to think a lot about how big of an effect of this treatment would need to be to change the minds of your colleagues, because that's what a trial is. A trial is a tool for changing minds. There is clinical practice as it is today. You have a bright idea. You are trying to improve clinical practice, but you need to get your colleagues to go along with you, right? So you need to design a trial that's going to at least give you, a good power to detect an effect that's worth knowing about. What's going to be convincing? Then you can get to kind of a next level. And so we start to talk about now more and more we're using this language around trials, around an estimand's framework. And an estimand is, you can just think of it as the universal truth that you want to use the trial to estimate. And so then we have to start getting into complicated things like, what if you have multiple outcomes? What are we going to do if this is a situation where patients might die halfway through? How do we account for that into the analysis? How do we account for loss to follow-up when people kind of have differential attribution? These kind of next level questions, again, are things that you can be thinking about, and they're all informed by the clinical context, not by the statistician, right? So this is the kind of next level of complication. All right, so just starting to wrap up very quickly here. I want to encourage people, if you're going to be involved in clinical trials, you need to be an engaged learner. And this is hard, it's hard to give this advice because I know you're already pressed for time. I know you already have limits, but you kind of do have to start to absorb trials, right? So like I've got Stephen Sin's book here. Anybody who knows me knows that this is my favorite book. You should have a copy of this if you're involved in trials. You're not going to understand it all. I don't understand it all, but it's the starting place of a conversation with a statistician. You have something to talk about, like, hey, this was a recommendation here. Can you help explain? Yeah, this is what that means. That's really helpful. And that's a very accessible book. Again, accessible doesn't always mean deep understanding, but it's not a book, that's full of gobbledygook. It's excellent. Start getting into the kind of guidance that's there for regulators, right? So this document here, Statistical Principles for Clinical Trials, that's not written for statisticians, right? It's only statisticians that read it. It's just written for investigators to understand. There's no equations in there. You're good. If you haven't found it before, the James Lynn Library has this amazing library, as it happens, of resources about clinical trials. Like, go and read some of the history, like get involved in understanding these things. To the Twitter point, you can get involved in social media. So there are lots of trialists, investigators, statisticians now on Twitter talking about trials. And importantly, that's where you're going to hear the unknown unknowns. If you're kind of earlier in your career and you're only looking to the people who work where you work and the more senior people, some of those senior people are going to be very good. Some of them don't know. I know this is shocking to hear sometimes, but some of them don't know things. And you kind of need to get out of that and get into a world of people outside where you work who will maybe speak some truth to what goes on. And so then you can understand, you can shine a light on your unknown unknowns, and start to learn stuff. So I do recommend, even if you're just lurking, Twitter can be a problem sometimes, but even if you're just lurking, it can be incredibly valuable. And we get other things like this. So it's a trial statistician from the state, Andrew Althouse. He's working on essentially a data discussion board that was started by Frank Harrell, who's a very well-known statistician involved in trials. And we've got this huge wiki. I say we, I've made like the teeniest contribution, but scores of people have contributed on papers to push back against this idea of common statistical myths. There are all these things that get published that are wrong and they use wrong methods. And no matter how many times we evidence that they're wrong methods, they keep happening because the person can always say, well, I'm going to do this because it got published in the Lancet, bringing us back to what we were saying before. So social media is a very good way to start to engage with a lot of this stuff too. All right, final point. I think I'm right on my time here. We have to talk about payment, right? And so this is more of a pet peeve thing, this idea, and I know it's good, it's well-intentioned, but people come to me, well, we can let you be an author. And the issue with that one is that authorship isn't yours to give, right? We have rules about who gets to be an author on things. And generally, if someone is the statistician, then they'd be involved in the design. And so they tick number one. And if they tick number one, if you're the investigator, you really have a responsibility to give them the option of whether they want to tick the other three requirements here, right? And it might be a situation where the statistician says, and I've been in this spot where it's like, no, you've handed me a design, I've executed the analysis, I've given you a few tips, but I don't think it qualifies for authorship. So please acknowledge the HRB, Clinical Research Facility Cork, and that'd be grand and good luck. But generally speaking, if someone's going to be the statistician on your trial, on your paper, they are an author unless they choose not to be. And I think people need to understand it. So offering to pay people with papers, even if well-intentioned, isn't useful. Which brings us to the final point, right? Well, if I'm not going to pay you an authorship, I can't sell you statistics. And this is, kind of a fundamental issue in the importance of having the clinical trial infrastructure. The way it works now is that I do pass along a cost to studies for my involvement. And most people understand the reason for why that has to happen. We have to have things resourced. The problem, though, is that it turns transactional. And if we go back to the first slide of the talk, it's that I feel like I'm responsible, not only person responsible, but I'm responsible for the scientific integrity of the trial. I can't sell that, right? You're not paying for a service. You're not paying for me to TNP the data and give you a result that you then go off and interpret, right? So this transactional kind of thing is a real problem as well. And it's something that we have to deal with all the time. And I'd like to be moving beyond it. Okay, so the very, 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 very last point is you have to do something about this. If you're a clinical investigator, you probably wield a lot more influence than you realize. If your job requires you to do research, then you need to make some noise and make sure that you get the support and collaboration required to ensure that that research is high quality. And it doesn't matter if this is how it's always been. And if you are a very senior person working in medicine, then it's especially important for you to make sure that you do everything you can to make sure that the support and collaboration is there. All right, so I will stop my rant and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Brilliant, Darren. That was really great. I love the slides. It's really, really interesting and so engaging, especially for non-stats heads like myself. We have a few questions coming now. Okay, so I'm just going to start with Katrina's question. So she's a question regarding the Lancet paper. In your view, should all research methodology be required to undergo statistician review prior to acceptance of publication as part of the ethics application for the trial stages, or as an appendix to the paper where justification for a particular approach or analysis is provided?
Yeah, it's a very tricky one. So I sit on an animal ethics committee, and somewhat ironically, in animal ethics world, it's kind of become clear that you require a statistician on ethics, because if the study is underpowered to detect the experimental effect they're interested in, then it's a waste of the animal. And we don't do that the same way in medicine. And I've never heard a convincing argument about why that's true. So on the one hand, the kind of, the blue sky answer is yes. I think ethical review of human studies should require a statistician sign off. Animal research is regulated in Ireland and elsewhere, and the regulator requires the statistician to say, yes, this is well designed. And I don't understand why we don't do it, except for the fact that it means resourcing people to actually do that work, and that we have entirely too many people who think that they can stand in for the statistician themselves. So that would be great. Now, in terms of kind of appendices, that people should be, these limits to publication now are largely gone. So I think it should be standard practice for people to include more information. Code sharing should be straightforward and doable. There's no reason not to share code. There's no reason not to add a couple pages explaining exactly what you did and why, even if the journal is asking you for a shorter paper. But I think all of that would be good practice for sure, and very little reason to do, except that you go back to this Doug Altman point, which is less research, right? So all that stuff you're talking about is obviously a really good idea, except there's 24 hours a day. It means doing less other things. And I don't know anybody who's ever been successful going to their university president or the CEO of the funder and saying, I've got a great idea. We're going to do less research. What do you think? Right? Pat on the back, so it's frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. Sean has a question then. Sean Tariq saying, there's another great Doug Altman quote from the same 1994 article you mentioned about the reason for much poor research being that people without all the necessary skills feel compelled for career reasons to do research and nobody stops them. How do you think we can stop people, and more often, and should we stop them?
It's very tricky. I think you kind of flip the question. Why do we require it of regulated studies? And, is it, where's the cart and where's the horse? Is it because they can pay? Is it because there's a profit motive? Or, so it's tricky. So I'm not someone who's generally like philosophically in the, has a lot of desire to stand over people and tell them how to do things. I'm happy to give advice, obviously. But, so in terms of what level of oversight you need, it's really tricky. But I think what we wind up doing, though, is maybe shoring up the things we have. Journals, there are so many journals now. BMJ is a standout and always has been for the quality of its statistical review. It's not replicated elsewhere, not consistently. And in some places it is, and when we start talking about, some of the kind of the bigger journals now, the headline journal with the 3 subtitles after it, we all know about, you can't convince me that the editorial and review processes there are anywhere up to scratch. So again, like until this underlying issue of publication is addressed, then I don't think these are very surmountable problems, sadly.
Okay, we have another question then from Fiona, and she's asking, in investigator trials, do most teams produce a statistical analysis plan as well as the protocol and shell tables, figures, and listings?
Yeah, so generally if it's investigator-led and regulated, then you would expect that for sure. In terms of like purely academic studies, I think the practices are very, very variable. And so if you've managed to find someone who puts value in that, and I think there's a lot of value in having a pre-specified statistical analysis plan, particularly for clinical trials. I think there's a lot of value in coding up the tables and the final report in advance and testing everything and making sure it works properly. That's all stuff that we do for sure. But if you were talking about the average kind of investigator-led trial in health broadly, I would say those things don't tend to happen.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question then, it's saying Irish researchers hugely lack statistical support. How do you feel this can be improved? We often can't offer the same pay scales as industry, and often stats jobs remain vacant.
It's a huge issue. That's a big part of it, right? Even in the UK, I look at jobs all the time, and we need a PhD, maybe someone with a master's, and $30K a year, and that's not, that's nothing to shake a stick at. But obviously there's a lot of need in industry in general, and also in, charities and all kinds of other, in government, people that have this skill set, and people do, they will get more money elsewhere. I mean, it is part of the issue. The challenging part, again, and not to beat a dead horse, but we make, for example, training more PhD students is typically seen as a solution to improving research. Training more PhD students doesn't improve research. And we see, getting in fellowships, for clinicians, we see that as an important way of building, growing research. That can help research if you get the right people doing that stuff. But we're very active in trying to fund those roles. And goodness gracious, if you get someone who wants the newest piece of, equipment to measure, measurement's obviously fundamental for science. And that's where the cutting edge usually is when we can make breakthroughs in measurement, and it opens up things. But at the same time, you'll see people, spend hundreds of thousands and more on this newfangled piece of equipment that'll be out in 5 years. But we can't find money for a statistician. And I mean, that's what it ultimately comes down to for me. You don't need a statistician on every corner of every block, but you see very high flying research institutions, that collectively don't bother to fund that position in anything that could be, reasonably sustainable. And I mean, shockingly enough, a lot of statisticians aren't necessarily interested in the industry kind of lifestyle. They might appreciate academia and they might take a little bit less money, but it has to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then kind of on a similar vein, then, do you think giving statisticians permanent contracts would alleviate the funding issue and therefore positively influence the involvement of the statistician from conceptualization through to reporting of the trial? And Darren, I think you're on mute.
There?
Yeah.
That's not specific to statisticians, right? That's kind of part of the point at the end there with the kind of how things get paid for is, you want to be incentivizing to make good decisions and good choices and not feeling compelled, to make suboptimal decisions and support things that maybe, you could do better without. And so again, but I think that's true for all kinds of roles in academia. Like, I mean, the university, and not to get off in, this tangent, but the university is full of people that are all necessary. Their role is necessary, but our approach to it is consistently to fill the gaps forever, never, never. And we train people and we watch them work for 2 years and we watch them go away and then we have to replace them. And as opposed to funding, career streams and structures for not just statisticians, but researchers in general. So yeah, I think it would be great. I just don't know who's gonna actually make the change.
Yeah, exactly. And then Fiona's come up with another question here. Where do data managers fit in? Do they exist in academia?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the answer is kind of like, it's no. So the clinical research facilities are another place where this kind of support happens. So Brendan and I work very closely together, Brendan Palmer, and he works with me as a statistician. But one of the things that we've done very early on, and not to like turn this into an advertisement, but we do the data and the statistics together, because if the data are of a good quality, it makes the statistics work easier. If the the statistical insights go into how the data should be collected, so that everything merges in. And so between the two of us, we try to handle the data and the statistics together, where Brendan takes the lead on the data side, I take the lead on the statistics, and then we collaborate going forward on both. And so I think that's a really important thing. The only other support for that in the university comes from the library. So the library is usually, the good port of call. And again, it's full of people who know so much more about that topic, if you're an academic researcher, than anybody else probably there. And so that would always be the first place I go to. But in terms of like having a role, again, it's something that often falls to research assistants and research support officers, or maybe the postdoctoral researcher has to brush up and that kind of thing. And it would be fundamentally, there's a reason that we do it ourselves, because we see so much value in it. And the HRB, of course, is extremely keyed up on this. Fair data stewardship, reproducibility, these are things that are becoming more and more important on the agenda. So I think we will see research institutions and universities start to adapt to that.
Yeah, we've had a comment then coming in from Alicia saying they have very limited experience in working on statistical consultancy, but having recently moved over from academia, is it that statisticians work with a very intimately involved in the studies we work on. Sorry. The last few studies I've worked on have been far more requiring off-the-shelf methods and have required an in-depth knowledge of the subject area, just as I would have needed working in the clinical trial unit on the studies, even playing policeman or trying to keep investigators on the straight and narrow. But I'm sure this may not be true everywhere.
No, that rings, that certainly conforms with what I think.
Yeah. That's interesting. One comment I would make as well. Oh, sorry, no, hang on before I go on my high horse. Oh, a few more coming. Right. Okay. So if you had 5 minutes with the HRB, what kind of funding and support would you ask them for statisticians?
So we need training in biostatistics. We need training in medical statistics. So we need some kind of an educational pathway. And it doesn't always have to go through into the doctoral level. Certainly, more master's degree in statistics, would help, but also some support, but focused on the health research, right? It's focused on the kind of biostat side, medical statistics side, I think would be great. I think that, again, I think the right idea is this move to support standing clinical trial infrastructure, thinking of the UK model with the clinical trials units that exist and are there, and that there are roles within those units that aren't reliant on the individual studies, that those roles can be sustainable, and that there's an actual pathway. There's people can progress and people can move up, if that makes sense, or also that people can, stay at the level they're at, if that's what they're good at and happy with. I think all of that stuff would go. So to keep doing what they're doing, HRB, you're doing great. Just more of it, as if.
Excellent.
And something with the TMRN. I mean, not to be ingratiating here, but this is exactly the thing. The work the TMRN does as well is, I think, vitally important, because this is the only way to be everywhere at once.
Yeah.
So this kind of stuff has been fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sean's come back with another comment there, just saying the reliance on soft funding in the UK and definitely in Ireland probably, research is bonkers. Exactly the point Darren is making. It's so hard to develop early career staff and careers to support high quality research, and not only in stats. So it's definitely true. And I think that's the end of our questions there now. But one thing that really struck me in your presentation was that a lot of the comments you've made come back to this building trust and relationships, and it's such a vital part of all research relationships. So I think it's really a good message about that. Definitely for me, that's rung true. So yeah, thank you so much, Darren. That's been brilliant.
My pleasure.
And thank you everyone for such engaging questions. It was really great. So just to finish off, remind us of your diary again, because this is becoming a really packed schedule for HRB-TMRN, but the next webinar is going to be on the 3rd of March, and that is titled The Use of Multiple Period Cluster Randomized Crossover Trial Design for Comparative Effective Research, and that's with Professor Carla Hemming, and that's the 3rd of March. The 24th of March, then we have a webinar on the influence and management of conflicts of interest in clinical trials, and that is from Lasse Ostengard from Denmark. And then also on the 25th of March, the following day, the Evidence and Thesis Ireland group have got another webinar, and that's Integrating Stakeholders, Informed Evidence and Core Outcome Set Development, and that's a case study analysis, and that is with Dr. Ginny Brunton from Ontario Tech University in Canada. And then a study day also on the 10th of March with UCC and the CRF as well. That's hosted by Dr. Francis Sheely, and that's with regards to registry-based randomized control trials, the uses, challenges and advantages of applications. So all of these events are all listed on our website, the HRB-TMRN .ie website, and you can go to our training section on that and you'll find all the details. So thank you so much, Darren. And I have to say, as somebody with no statistical background whatsoever, I really enjoy your tweets on Twitter. So I would recommend anyone listening in to have a good follow of you. You're great.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.